any other political actor. And when they cling to power, they don't cling to power equally effectively. As we've already established, the characteristics of these regimes can have a lot to do with their tendency to break down or their tendency to give way. And because of this, it becomes really important for us to study those characteristics of the regimes and then take a look at when and why they break down and under what circumstances. And so the first thing that we're going to do today is address a question. And the question is, which type of regime do you think stays in power the longest? Previously, I asked you, what type of regime do you think is the most common? Now I'm asking you, what type of regime do you think stays in power the longest? Military regimes, one-party regimes, multi-party regimes, personalist regimes, or ruling monarchies? And I think that the best way for us to do this is for me to put you in those little groups. Now, I know that we're not a big fan of this, but I think that you learn a great deal from each other, and I want you to exchange information and ideas and discuss this together. And I'm watching the number of participants right now because whenever I mention groups, there's always a few people who leave, who leave the meeting. Please don't leave the meeting. Just try to engage. So I'm going to put you in those breakout rooms, and I'm going to make rooms of, let's see. I'm going to make 10 rooms for all 37 of us, and that's 3 or 4 total. Now, what I'd like you to do as you get into those rooms is discuss this question. Which type of regime do you think stays in power the longest? Beginning with that assumption that all actors want to stay in power and that dictators are no exception. I'm curious what ideas you have, what you took from the reading, and I'd like you to discuss this together, and we'll take about 3 or 4 minutes tops, and then we'll get back together and we'll have a discussion as a group. All right, everybody, I'm going to close the rooms and I'm going to bring you back, okay? All right, as we rejoin the class, I'd like to hear from as many groups as possible. What did you discuss? What conclusion did you reach? Why did you reach that conclusion? Were there disagreements in your group? Were there different perspectives? I'd like to hear as much about what you talked about as possible.
So, with my group, we were kind of like all just like figuring out like why each party kind of like stays like tries to like do their grab and power, and like obviously each like version of a dictatorship has their own tactics, whereas like you see like military authoritarianism is kind of like the scare tactic of like violence, whereas like other ones just like personalist regimes, they're trying to like stay in power by literally just keeping it in their family line and kind of like having that be their source of power. And my personal opinion is that one party authoritarianism would be like the type of regime that could stay in power the longest, just because you have supporters of the party, obviously, and with that, you'll then obviously be able to get more and more sources of obtaining said power and like being able to keep that for like as long as possible. Whereas like things like personalist regimes, like yeah, it's like a power within like one person or like a family, but that's only so many people and that can easily be like overthrown. Like military authoritarianism, like coups happen, and like there are other types of ways to like get that out, or like multi-party, like so with one party authoritarianism, like you already have a strong support base because it's pretty much an entire party of people who are like at least agree with you, or like-minded individuals. And with that, as long as you keep on like trying to get people and more people to the party, you'll pretty much be able to like remain in power.
Yeah, that's a great argument, Daniela. That's right on the money. One thing that we sometimes forget is that authoritarian regimes have politics too. You know, there's no dictator who's omnipotent. They require the support of allies and supporters, just like democratic governments do. And so, with that in mind, it makes sense that maybe a one-party authoritarian regime would last longer because that party already has supporters, already has allies, and the leaders of the party can use the party as a vehicle to mobilize support, and the support base is going to be larger just in general than say the support base in a personalist regime where maybe it's a single individual or their family. How large will the support base be? Will it extend beyond the family or the immediate allies of the family? Similarly with the military is often very popular, but it's not a political party, right? It won't enjoy the same support. It's a very good argument. I'd like to hear from others. What are some other perspectives, or what are some other ideas?
Um, so for my group, like we mainly discussed monarchies, and I think if we look throughout all of human history, it's hard to say that monarchies weren't the one that lasted the longest. Now, the distinction you'd have to make though is between just like monarchy in general and specific dynasties, because there have been dynasties that have literally lasted like you know, not that much at all, like less than a year even. But then there have been dynasties that have lasted for thousands. Like if we look at Japan, literally as long as they ever had a monarchy, they've had the same exact dynasty. But then you start getting into other things like, you can't really argue that Japanese politics today are the same as they were 1,000 years ago,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so, but but even then, if you look at like the UK, for example, they've had the same dynasty since 1700 something, but the politics are much different now, and in a way the regime changed from a authoritarianish one to a democracy today. So it kind of depends on what you mean, like specifically, but I think in terms of like the longest lasting, especially compared to all of these other ones, it's monarchy.
Yeah, John, that's a great point. And I'm going to give you an example that serves your argument really well, which is the example of Saudi Arabia. That's a ruling monarchy where the same family has been in charge for like what, hundreds of years, maybe even like more than 1,000 years or something, like just like some really long time. And it testifies to the strength and the endurance of these types of regimes. And your point about the survival of the Japanese monarchy, you didn't mention the Thai monarchy, but that's another one. The monarchy in the UK. Some of those are obviously traditional monarchies. We don't think of them as ruling monarchies, but your point is a good one, which is that there might be something about these types of regime that makes them last a long time and makes them capable of fending off opponents who might change the regime. Can we hear some other ideas? This is all very good.
I got here late, so I apologize. I wasn't able to speak to a group, but the regime type that I think would stay in power for the longest was the one that John was previously stating was ruling monarchies. I think this because divine intervention or sort of like a supranational figure outside of the monarchs allows for a justification to exist for those people to stay in power in ways that military authoritarianism or personalist regimes don't have, or in the case of personalist regimes, have for a very short time.
So from your point of view, Ishan, ruling monarchies can legitimate themselves.
Yeah, they can legitimate themselves in a way that's more palpable to the citizens, and while not necessarily removing calls for democracy, that can limit them in a way that other authoritarian types don't have access to.
I see. And there's a good set of evidence here if you go to the Middle East and you study the failure of revolutions during the Arab Spring. In the end, only one Arab country transitioned to democracy, and that was Tunisia. Tunisia was not a ruling monarchy. Tunisia was a personalist regime, a ruling presidential regime. Those other countries in the Middle East that were subject to that uprising were by and large ruling monarchies. Syria was sort of a personalist regime. But other countries like Saudi Arabia and others, those are ruling monarchies, and they've been profoundly robust and resistant to change. And so there's something about ruling monarchies perhaps that makes them survive. We'll evaluate some data later and we'll take a look at whether that's what the data shows us. But there's a real argument to be made here that one party regimes and ruling monarchies will probably outlast other types of regime. Can you think of other arguments that we could make in support of either of these positions, or does anyone else have a different perspective? Let's hear from some more people. Robin,
Professor, what's the difference between a one-party authoritarianism and ruling monarchies?
yeah, good question, Karen. So a one-party authoritarian regime is an authoritarian regime that's dominated by a single party. And that single party does not allow other parties to exist. And that party monopolizes control of the state. So China, Vietnam, Laos, these are all communist one-party regimes. There's a single party. If you vote in an election in China, you vote for one of any number of hand-picked candidates picked by the Politburo of the Communist Party. There's a one-party regime in China. A ruling monarchy, on the other hand, is an authoritarian regime that's dominated by a single family, and they choose leaders based upon essentially succession rules that usually relate to the line of descent. So father will pass power to son, and so on and so forth. The whole point is that power is concentrated in the hands of a single family as opposed to a single party. So a one-party regime is all about one party. A ruling monarchy is all about, one family. Robbins says, don't most ruling monarchies eventually turn into figureheads or have their power restricted by other institutions, i.e. England, Spain, if they transition to democracy? So there's an important distinction here between ruling monarchies and traditional monarchies. So the UK, Japan, those are traditional monarchies. Those are formally democratic systems where there's a symbolic figurehead in the form of a monarch or a queen or whatever. Those are not ruling monarchies. Those are traditional monarchies. Spain would also be a traditional monarchy. It's effectively a democracy. There's no real power in the hands of the monarch. Power is in the hands of elected officials. And so they may have their power restricted and it may become a traditional monarchy, but not always. So countries like Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Oman, those are ruling monarchies. Those are countries where the traditional monarchy never turned into a traditional monarchy. It's still a ruler. They still rule the country. And so whether it's a traditional monarchy or a ruling monarchy has to do with whether or not the monarch or the family still rules the country. Arturo says, I believe that the United States is the best example of a multi-party autocracy. There have only been two parties close to the birth of the nation. But remember, Arturo, that we defined a multi-party autocracy as an authoritarian regime where multiple parties are allowed to compete, but where the incumbent government tilts the playing field to give themselves an advantage and give a disadvantage to the opposition. So technically the United States is a democracy. It's not an authoritarian regime. It's not a multi-party autocracy. We have two parties, but a democracy can have two parties. And the reason we have two parties has a lot to do with the way we count the votes and the way that we distribute seats according to the votes and the outcomes of the election. We have majoritarian institutions. So if you run for office in a given district and you win that district, you take the whole constituency. You represent the whole district. Now, that's important because of that reality, the system has basically dwindled down to two parties because voters recognize that if they vote for third parties, instead of the top two parties competing for that seat, they may well waste their vote. Parties similarly have an incentive to try to join forces and kind of combine forces because, again, only a single party wins the constituency in that race, that electoral competition. So the United States is a democracy. It's not a multi-party autocracy. A multi-party autocracy would be something more along the lines of, say, Kenya until 2002, where there was an incumbent government in Daniel Arap Moi, but there were multiple parties who were allowed to compete and who frequently would actually, give Arap Moi's party a run for their money in elections. Do we have any more comments about this before we continue? So what I'm going to show to you today, and what I may show to you on Monday of next week, if we can't finish it today, is that the evidence suggests that one-party authoritarian regimes last the longest. And military authoritarian regimes appear to be the most short-lived by contrast. Personalist regimes appear to be about the second longest lasting. Multi-party autocracies after that. The data and the evidence is sort of inconclusive regarding the survival of ruling monarchies. What we know is that those that do exist and still exist have been in place for a long time, but it's not necessarily clear that that is the general pattern because many ruling monarchies have become democracies in the past. And so even though the Middle East still has many ruling monarchies, we really can't be sure at this stage what the fate of those ruling monarchies might be in a more general statistical sense, because the data is inconclusive. But this is the discussion we'll have today. And the way we're going to do this is by beginning on a more theoretical level and analyzing and evaluating the differences between these regimes and how they make these different regimes more or less prone to democratization. And so the starting point for this is the simple observation that the differences between types of authoritarian regime cause those regimes to break down in systematically different ways. So what we discussed on Monday, those types of authoritarian regime, becomes very important now, because the differences between them, we are going to link closely to the possibility of regime change in those types of systems. Now, before we continue, let me take a look at the chat. What would North Korea be considered? It would be a personalist regime, right? North Korea is a bit of a mishmash of different types. To be fair, it's what it is a monarchical, military-backed, one-party communist regime. It's kind of a mix of a lot of those things. It has monarchical elements because power is passed from father to son. It has communist one-party elements because it is a communist party. It is a one-party regime, but it's also backed by the military. And so it's a lot of those things. But what it is above all is a totalitarian regime. And by that, we mean that it mobilizes the population, it suppresses all forms of dissent, and in general, it controls every aspect of life. And so that totalitarian regime is distinctive because there really aren't any others left. It's the last Stalinist regime in the world, the North Korean regime. So we're going to begin this discussion by dealing with military regimes and the ways that military regimes are predisposed to regime change. And in this theoretical world that we're starting with, we begin with those factions within the military that we talked about. We talked about how there are factions within the military earlier on in the course, the softliners and the hardliners. Now, these factions are locked into a struggle, and some of them want to intervene in politics, and some of them want to stay out. But remember that militaries, above all, value unity and the survival of the military as an institution. And so what that means is that both hardliners and softliners will only pursue their goal as long as unity is upheld. And so this makes military regimes highly vulnerable to internal splits. If a military regime, on balance, is composed of officers who agree with that dictatorship and don't want change, then they are united. But if within that military regime, a set of officers begins to disagree with the continuation of that military regime and thinks that they should step down and leave power, then the military regime becomes fragmented and unity is lost. This makes that military regime highly vulnerable to splits because those different factions that agree and disagree will begin to pull apart. An economic crisis deepens the splits in the officer corps, and it makes it even harder for the military to maintain unity. Now, what's the point of all this? The point of all this is that these internal splits and this value that they place on unity and the survival of the military, the problems that they cause can be eased by leaving power. Also, there is life after dictatorship for the military. They'll just go back to the barracks and continue defending the country. They'll collect a nice fat budget. They'll negotiate a transition, and they'll enjoy themselves, into their later years. And they won't worry about it because they've left power and they've done their work. In this regard, there's a lot waiting for the military should they choose to step down. And so, interestingly, militaries are often motivated by a desire to step down in order to maintain unity and in order to tap into that life after dictatorship. So when they face those splits over policy or succession or who should become the leader, officers tend to liberalize the regime and they return to the barracks. They call elections and they get out. In this way, we can conclude then that military regimes have a built-in mechanism that makes them more likely both to transition to democracy and to be more limited in duration when they actually do exist. Now, remember that, because we'll return to this momentarily as we address a list of hypotheses that we'll test in data to see what patterns are actually revealed out there in the world. But before we do that, let's take a look at an example. I want to show you what I mean and what we mean when we say that military regimes don't tend to last very long and how they tend to be brought down by internal splits. And so the example I want to use is the example of Ecuador. Now, Ecuador during the 20th century fell to military rule so many times that it's difficult to count. But the last military regime in Ecuador stood out because it seems to resemble this pattern quite closely. So in 1972, when the last military regime in the country took power, the military took power at a moment of economic growth and abundance. And in particular, the country had just discovered oil. Now, the discovery of oil meant that Ecuador could invest in a lot of state projects, expand the economy, and it also meant that they could obtain a lot of loans from overseas because they were viewed as good for it. They've got all that oil, they'll be able to pay it off, why not? But what happened during the course of the 1970s was there was a series of global economic slowdowns that were related to oil shocks. Basically, what happened was the economic slowdown led to an increase in the debt load shouldered by Latin American countries, including Ecuador, who had borrowed loans denominated in US dollars. This meant that they now owed much more in debt than they previously did because their loan, the value of the loan increased because the dollar became much more expensive. In response to this debt crisis and this economic downturn, the officer corps split over policy, and they began to disagree about what to do and how to deal with the situation. In 1976, the first sign of distress appeared when a coup brought the armed force commanders to power with a plan to transition to democracy. They said on the day they took power, January 11th, we will initiate democratic elections. By 1979, those elections took place. In that same year, the military voluntarily handed power over to a civilian government. Now, this took 7 years. In 7 years, the military came to power, split over policy, and then walked out. That's a very short time for a regime, an authoritarian regime. But it goes to what I just told you, which is that these militaries are willing to leave power and step down, even if they just took power a few years ago, if their unity is threatened by the circumstances. And in this case, the unity was threatened, and so they stood down. One-party regimes have very different dynamics. So remember that one-party regimes are important because no members of the regime have an incentive to break off. The rival factions within the ruling party depend on that party. They depend on that party for any benefits or any power that they might obtain. So even if they themselves don't enjoy maybe the full fruits of being in power, because as a rival faction, they're actually opposed to another faction within the party, they know that if in the future they want to take power, they'll have to do it through the party. So they have no incentive to break off. Similarly, single parties can weather the death of founders and leaders. Just find some other party leader who can take the reins. You don't have to worry about the death of a personalist dictator and then a power vacuum that will be filled by the military or a democratic opposition. It's also the case that one-party regimes can typically claim the loyalty of many people in society. The reason is because they use patronage, they use state enterprises, they use all sorts of intervention in the economy in order to transfer benefits to large swaths of the society. Just like Daniela said, one-party regimes are more likely to be open to all loyal citizens, especially compared to personalist regimes, which are centered around a single family and where there's really more of an emphasis on family relations and relatives and close friends. In general, one-party regimes are less likely to limit their clientele to a particular clan, region, or group. They're much more likely to expand the radius of the party and develop relationships with much broader constituencies. Let's take a look at an example to show you what I mean. Now, because of these circumstances and these characteristics, power struggles inside one-party regimes tend not to result in transitions because the members of the party, the cadres, all have the same incentive to use the party to gain power as opposed to bringing down the regime, and because their benefits depend on the party. Now, the key point to this is that one-party regimes have a mechanism that makes them less likely to democratize and more likely to last longer. And one of the best examples is the Institutional Revolution Party in Mexico. Now, it's the PRI, as we call it, that held power from 1929 to 2000. That's 71 years. That's an enormous amount of time for a single party to hold power. Now compare that to the 7 years that the military was in power in Ecuador, and you begin to see the difference. Now, how did the PRI hold power? They used patronage, they used corruption, they used cronyism, and in general, they transferred benefits to as many people in as large a group as they could so as to remain in power. Now, personalist regimes are a little bit different. Remember that personalist regimes are regimes that are based around an individual and their family, but it's primarily an individual who concentrates power. Now, personalist regimes are less vulnerable than military regimes, but more robust than one-party regimes for 3 reasons. First, these regimes rarely survive after the death of the leader. Anytime a leader dies, it creates a succession problem. In fact, the problem of succession has been called the Achilles heel of all authoritarian regimes because, especially in a personalist regime, the death of the leader creates a power vacuum. Someone will fill that void. Who will fill that void? Will it be another leader, another dictator, or will it be a democratic opposition who brings about democratic elections and ousts the ruling cadre? Good question. The truth is that regimes rarely survive after the death of the leader. Most of the time, the regime depends on that leader. And if that leader dies, the regime collapses as well. It's also the case that, like Daniela said, these personalist regimes have a very narrow support base. They have a huge collection of people who might oppose them or challenge the regime who don't benefit from the benefits that are transferred to the family or to the relatives. And in that way, there are many challengers to the regime. There are many possible opponents or many possible contenders. And then thirdly, because personalist regimes are so dependent on using corruption to keep loyalty, private benefits for private supporters, they're very vulnerable to economic crisis. Because if the economy is struck with downturn, there's less revenue in the coffers, there are fewer material foundations with which to prop up the supporters who you rely on. You can no longer use patronage and corruption in the same way. And those are especially important for personalist regimes in light of how narrow their support base is. Jose says, like what happened in Venezuela. Yoel says, would this be the case for Cuba? After Castro passed away in 2016, his brother took over, though recently power shifted from Raul Castro towards a non-Castro. Yoel, do you think that Cuba is, do you think it's a personalist regime or do you think that it's a one-party regime? Because it is still sort of a communist regime, right? Jose says, like what happened in Venezuela. So in Venezuela, I think a better description of Venezuela would be to call it a multi-party autocracy because the Socialist Party, who rules through Maduro, does have opposition in the form of multiple parties who do compete in elections. It's just that the playing field is very uneven. I think at this point, Venezuela has shifted to maybe a full-blown authoritarian regime. And I think that multi-party autocracy does capture it more or less. Although it's somewhat personalist, although the support of the party is important. Yoel, I'd be curious about that. I don't know a lot about Cuba, to be honest with you. I did know that Castro passed away in 2016 and that Raul Castro took power. I think the key question is it now a communist or a one-party regime? Is it no longer personalist? That's a good question. I think we should learn more about Cuba. I admit I don't know enough about it. So let me give you an example of a transition from personalist rule. And I want to show you in particular how the narrow support base mentioned by Daniela becomes problematic for these types of regimes. So the example is Tunisia. And Tunisia is one of the world's newest democracies. It became one in 2014. Its transition began in 2011, as you know. But the story really begins in 1987 when Ben Ali took power. During the period between 87 and 2011, Ben Ali created a support base that largely relied on the middle class and urban groups, relatively wide support base for a personalist ruler. But the issue was that joblessness and hunger were really a problem among lower and working classes in particular. And those were precisely the groups who would rise up and rebel beginning in 2011 in January of that year and eventually overthrow Abiy, which they did later that year. And this transition, this uprising, this collapse of personalist rule has largely been viewed as a rebellion by neglected, marginalized social classes. These are precisely the groups who we should expect to oppose personalist rule, because personalist rule generally requires supporting those wealthy or able or well-positioned supporters who the survival of your regime depends on. Now, does the survival of your regime depend on the working classes and the lower classes? You might not think that it does, but in this case, the failure to cater to those groups is possibly what overthrew Abiy in the case of Tunisia. So this is an example of a transition from personalist rule. And this shows you how that narrower support base can become problematic when the rest of society is experiencing difficult circumstances economically, when they begin to discredit and blame the incumbent government in Abiy. Now, let's discuss multi-party autocracies in regime change. Now, multi-party autocracies, as I mentioned, these are authoritarian regimes where more than one party exists. The incumbent government usually tilts the playing field to advantage themselves and disadvantage the opposition, but it is still possible, theoretically, for some of those other parties to win power because they compete in elections that, though uneven, can actually produce an outcome that may not be intended by the regime or that may not keep the regime in power. So these types of regime, these multi-party autocracies like Kenya until 2002, like Venezuela between about 2005 and 2014 or 16, like say Bolivia to a certain extent between 2019 and 2020, although that might be a stretch. These one-party regimes, they respond more to reform demands for political reasons. So why is that? Because when you have multiple parties, there's the possibility that other parties can win more support if they're more responsive to demands for reform. So the regime itself has to respond at least somewhat to those same demands if they want to politically play the game in a savvy way. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, that might mean that they're willing to acquiesce to a democratic transition if they think that they can retain some influence, if the party in power can retain some influence through the transition, or if they think they can control the transition. The second reason is that opposition pushes the system toward greater democratization. So it's not just that voters demanding reform are responded to more by regimes. It's also the case that the opposition to the regime itself is pushing for greater democratization. The reason is because democratization in democracy represents a route that they can take to become more competitive in that system. elections are a thing, and they may be tilted in a way that gives an advantage to the incumbent, but elections are the way that they can win power. And so it makes sense for them to push for greater democratization. And so they do. These two factors theoretically can push one-party regimes, multi-party regimes to democratize. So let's take a look at a transition from multi-party rule. And this is the case of Kenya that I've mentioned a few times. So Daniel Arap Moi was president of Kenya between 1978 and 2002, and he was leader of KANU, the Kenyan African National Union. And in a classic case of tilting the playing field, in the first two multi-party elections, which took place in 1992 and 1997, Moi used patronage, harassment, and abused state funds to tilt the playing field and co-opt and divide the opposition. This was a classic use of state resources and state funds to alter the playing field and introduce irregularities in the election that would hand his party and him electoral victory. Now in 2002, Arap Moi's successor lost the election to a broad-based coalition of opposition parties. Those opposition parties never went away. Despite the uneven playing field, they were always there. And this is the essence of a multi-party system, where the continued existence of multiple parties means that it's always possible for some opposition coalition to form and crush the incumbent government in an election. And that's what happened in 2002 with the National Rainbow Coalition. And this is a picture from the victory of the National Rainbow Coalition in 2002 in the Kenyan elections. Now, we normally discuss Kenya because of reasons that relate to election violence and some of the difficulties of consolidating democracy in multi-ethnic societies. But Kenya is also important, obviously, because of its transition from multi-party autocracy to formal democracy. In 2002 was an important year, an important milestone in that process. Now, we get to monarchies. And monarchies have been one of the more interesting points of this discussion, because many of you have talked about how monarchies appear to be capable of surviving for long periods because of the way that they're organized and because of just the empirical record, which shows that they've existed for hundreds and thousands of years in some places. Now, it is true that monarchies have established rules for leadership succession. Father passes power to son in a simplified world, or so on and so forth. The point is, there's always some line of descent that can be used as a line of leadership succession within a monarchy because of its familial basis. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the members of the royal family are in charge of the different provinces, and other members of the family have all sorts of important posts that fall within the system. And who takes those roles depends on, well, the family itself and the line of descent. And so it's relatively clear who will take what position at what moment in time in response to either a death in the family or someone's resignation or whatever. But let's actually play devil's advocate, and let's consider for a moment that other traits might make these regimes more transition prone than we might think, and maybe even more transition prone than one-party regimes. So monarchies, in the first place, have a small inner circle. They have a small inner circle because these royal families, except in rare circumstances, are very small. That means then that there's a great potential for factionalism, because there can be disagreements among the members of the family. But there may also be life after dictatorship for the royal family. So think about all these traditional monarchies that we've talked about. These are monarchies that previously were ruling monarchies. There was a point in time in England and in Spain where the head of government in main authority was concentrated in the hands of a king or a royal figure. Now, in those countries today, democracy reigns, but monarchy still exists in a sort of symbolic form. And so in the same way that the military can step down from power and return to the barracks and enjoy life after dictatorship, monarchies might be able to do so as well. and especially if they've been particularly respectful of human rights during their term. Now, these are theoretical reasons. The truth is that in a moment, we'll examine some data to try to figure out what actually is the case when we look out there in the wild. But for now, I want you to consider the possibility that monarchies might work in multiple ways, that they might lend themselves to survival, but that they might also lend themselves to transition. Okay, so we have these 5 hypotheses. These are 5 hypotheses that summarize the expectations that we just generated. First, military regimes are more likely than one-party regimes to democratize. It's because military regimes have those built-in mechanisms that one-party regimes don't. Second, personalist regimes are more likely than one-party regimes to democratize because they have a narrower support base and they're more likely to inflame opposition. Third, military regimes are more likely than personalist regimes to democratize. Military regimes place a greater value on the unity of the organization than do the cadres in that personalist regime who don't necessarily belong to an organization and might only be connected to the family or the individual in charge in a small way. Fourth, multi-party autocracies are more likely than one-party regimes to democratize. Why? Because in multi-party autocracies, there are multiple parties who push the regime towards greater democratization because that's how those parties can defeat the incumbent government. Also because the incumbent government has to be more responsive to demands for reform precisely because of their need to remain in power and fend off the opposition. It's possible, for example, that the incumbent party in a multi-party autocracy might remain the dominant party in a democracy. 5, monarchies are more likely than one-party regimes to democratize. The reason we suggest this is a possibility, because monarchies have life after dictatorship and because they have a small inner circle. Arturo says, could monarchies get back power after? Do you mean could the democracy revert back to monarchy or monarchical rule? Theoretically, yes. Theoretically, anything could happen. Has that happened? I don't know. I don't know if that's happened. But it's certainly true that democracies have reverted to authoritarian rule in the past and will again in the future. And so I'd be curious to see if monarchies can get back power. My sense, though, is that maybe that's quite unusual. So we arrive at this question: how can we measure this? How can we measure regime survival? Assuming that these hypotheses can be tested in data, what are some different ways that we can evaluate them and try to actually get a handle on the relative survival rates of the different regimes? So we have really 4 ways of doing this. First, we can measure the average length of rule for a given regime type. What's the average survival time or length of rule for different types of regime? Pretty straightforward. We can also talk about the average age of those regimes that survive. So those regimes that don't peter out, what's the average age of those? Third, we can take a look at the percent of regimes that survive at a given point in time. So say we choose 1998 or 2020 or 2010. If we examine the percent of regimes surviving at those 3 points in time, that would be another way for us to figure out how regime survival is affected by different regime types. And then fourth, we can look at the failure rate of different types of regime. That is to say, what proportion of regimes of a given type failed during a certain period. And we can demarcate those periods in terms of 5 or 10 years or however many years we want. So these are 4 different ways that we can measure regime survival. Pretty straightforward. And what I want you to take from this is that whenever we measure something, we want to try to measure it a couple different ways. And there usually are a couple different ways that we can do it in order to get a handle on what we want to try to understand. Okay, so first, let's take a look at the durability of different types of authoritarian regime. This is a table from the Geddes reading that you did for this week. And what I want to show you is the 3 columns. First, the average length of rule in terms of years. the average age of the surviving regimes, those regimes that survive, and then the percent of regimes that survived at a given point in time, that point in time being 1998. What I want to show you is that, consistent with our expectations, military regimes last the shortest, average length of about 8.8 years. Personal regimes last longer, average length of about 15.1 years. Single party regimes, although there's a lot of cross-contamination here, tend to last a little bit longer, 22.7 years. So far, that's consistent with our expectations. Let's take a look at the column for the average age of surviving regimes. What do we see here? We see that the average age of those regimes that survive that are military regimes is 7.3. The average age of those regimes that survive that are personal regimes is 18.8. The average age of those surviving regimes that are single party regimes is 35.1. So yet again, you see consistency between our expectations in the actual data. All of this seems to support our perspective so far. Let's take a look at our third column, the percent of regimes surviving in 1998. When it came to military regimes, 11.4% of them were surviving. Personal regimes, 15.7% were surviving. Single party regimes, 50% were surviving. Look at that. That's remarkable. Yet again, we see a pattern that's consistent with what we expected, and we see that single party regimes last the longest. Now, this data is for the period between 1946 and 1998. So this means that those single party regimes in place in 1946, 50% of them were still surviving in 1998. Those PRI party-like regimes, the example of Mexico, in this case, then looks to be quite run-of-the-mill. It looks like most one-party regimes last a very long time. In this case, 50 years is the average. Of course, the PRI lasted 71 years, but that's right up there, and they seem to have the same pattern. So what we can conclude from this table is that one-party regimes last longer than military regimes, personalist regimes last longer than military regimes, and one-party regimes last longer than personalist regimes. Okay, that's consistent with our expectations. That's what we thought we would find. That's what we hypothesized. But we can also look at another way of measuring this, and this is the failure rate of authoritarian regimes. This is that fourth one that we talked about. And what I want you to pay attention to is the overall average mortality rate per 5-year period. What we've got is different 5-year periods during which the proportion of that type of regime failed is represented by this statistic here. But look at the average. What you see is that the average death rate or failure rate per 5-year period of single party regimes was only 8%. Only 8%. That means only 8% of regimes failed on average during these 5-year periods. On the personalist regime level, 20% of those regimes on average failed during 5-year periods measured here. When it came to military regimes, 35% of them failed during the 5-year periods measured here. And so yet again, we see consistency. We see consistency between our expectations and the actual data. And I want you to notice the immense difference between, for example, military regimes and single party regimes. Single party regimes being insulated from those destabilizing forces that often take out military regimes much, much earlier on and help to explain why military regimes fail at higher rates than single party regimes. And so what this table allows us to conclude is that military regimes fail at higher rates than personalist regimes, military regimes fail at higher rates than one-party regimes, and personalist regimes fail at higher rates than one-party regimes. Now, you might be saying, well, what about monarchies and what about multi-party autocracies? Well, we need to look to some other data from the TRL reading from this week in order to evaluate that. And what we're looking at here is different regimes compared to one-party regimes as the reference category. And what I want you to focus on is general increases in democracy scores. And remember that TRL is thinking about democracy not necessarily in terms of democratization, but in terms of democratic reforms and movements towards democracy. This is a way that TRL gets at some of the more fine-grained changes that might be consistent with democratization. And what we find is quite interesting. First, we find that monarchies are not statistically different than one-party regimes in terms of their propensity to democratize. Notice here, we have monarchy. We do show that the coefficient is negative, which suggests that monarchies are less likely to democratize, but it's not statistically significant, which means that we can't say with any confidence that monarchies are actually less likely to democratize than one-party regimes. And remember too, that it actually worked the other way. We thought that monarchies would be more likely to democratize. So this data seems to undermine our hypothesis. Military regimes increase their democracy scores by about 0.038 more than one-party regimes, though this is not statistically significant. So this is not statistically significant either, and so we can't really say much about that either. What is statistically significant is the coefficient for multi-party regimes, which is right here. And this is significant, which tells us then that multi-party regimes increase their democracy scores by 0.186 more than one-party regimes. So it is true that multi-party regimes are more likely to democratize. They have a higher propensity to democratize because in this data set, during the period from 1972 to I believe 2005, multi-party regimes were more likely to democratize or more likely to undertake those democratic reforms. And specifically, they were 0.186 more likely than one-party regimes. So this does seem to suggest that multi-party regimes are in fact more likely to democratize than one-party regimes. So we have some results here. We have some results here for our analysis of regime type and regime survival. First, our hypothesis that military regimes are more likely than one-party regimes to democratize, it's true. It's true. We were able to show that. We found that though it wasn't statistically significant in the TRL data, we found that more or less military regimes appear to last longer than one-party regimes. Second, we found that personalist regimes are in fact more likely than one-party regimes to democratize. They lasted for shorter periods of time and they had a higher propensity to democratize. Thirdly, we found that military regimes are in fact more likely than personalist regimes to democratize. Not surprising, we saw that in the data as well, in the duration of military regimes relative to personalist regimes. Fourth, we saw multi-party autocracies as being more likely than one-party regimes to democratize. That is true. We saw that multi-party autocracies do appear to be subject to those democratizing pressures and do appear to be more responsive to demands for reform. And then finally, we saw that monarchies are more likely than one-party regimes to democratize. We saw that that is false. In fact, we can't say with certainty that monarchies are more likely than one-party regimes to democratize. In fact, the coefficient was negative, suggesting they're less likely, but it was not statistically significant. So we cannot say with certainty. It's at the in the best case scenario, it's ambiguous whether monarchies truly are more likely than one-party regimes to democratize. So what this tells us is that different types of regimes have different propensities to democratize because of their institutional characteristics. Those institutional characteristics matter a great deal because they make these regimes more or less vulnerable to collapse. But the truth is that these characteristics of regimes themselves don't necessarily make the regimes collapse. What makes the regimes collapse are moments or events that destabilize those regimes and kind of accentuate those internal divisions or the weaknesses of the regime. So to explain this, we have to return to our original assumption, which is that dictatorships want to keep power. But to keep power, they have to distribute benefits to supporters. They need good economic performance. They need political stability to do that. But sometimes events beyond their control compromise their ability to do those things. Those events are what we refer to as exogenous shocks. These are events that originate from outside of a system and destabilize that system. So that includes wars, the collapse of the Soviet Union, global economic crises, etc. These shocks affect regime survival, and it makes it harder to distribute benefits. Why is that important? It's important because it highlights the weaknesses and the dependencies of these regimes, and it shows that those regimes ultimately depend on certain circumstances to remain in power. As a result of all of this, authoritarian regimes tend to break down amid these external shocks. So for example, the second oil crisis in the late 1970s made it very difficult for military regimes to supply passable economic performance. Just like we saw in the Ecuador case, the debt crisis exploded the balance of payments issues experienced by the military government. They had to call democratic elections because they had such intense internal splits regarding how to deal with that issue. And if we pan out and notice the data in the big picture, we see that of the 14 military regimes in power just prior to the second oil crisis in 1979, all had fallen by 1988. So within less than a decade of that 1979 oil crisis, all military regimes were brought down by the crisis. Now, the crisis obviously interacted with other factors, but the point that we want to make here is that, as in Ecuador, these difficulties magnify pre-existing splits within the military. And so when it becomes hard for regimes to continue to satisfy supporters, those splits that might exist inside them deepen. And in the case of the military, they become especially problematic. Personalist regimes also fell at an increased rate in the early 1990s. The economic crisis really undercut the bases of personalism, the materialist bases. Personalist regimes rely on corruption and patronage to satisfy supporters, and pressure from donors and lenders who financed a lot of these regimes and made it possible for them to invest in these ways often forced rulers to cut the state spending and intervention that had been most politically useful for them. And so without these sweeteners, these allies deserted their leaders. And so in the 1990s, we saw a lot of personalist regimes begin to collapse, not just because of the narrowness of the support base, but because of the reliance of personalist regimes on corruption and economic performance. When corruption and economic performance were affected, those things became sources of tension and destabilized the regimes and ultimately brought them down. It wasn't possible to engage in the same degree of corruption because the economy wasn't performing. They could not patronize, they could not use cronyism, contracts, and other transfers to keep the support of their allies. And quickly that narrow support base dependent on the economy collapsed. Now, the one type of regime that has been remarkably resilient is the one-party regime. Now, these have shown themselves to be remarkably resilient. Malaysia, Singapore, and Taiwan all prospered until the late 1990s. The Soviet Union collapsed, as we know, but many outside of it lived on, including China, Vietnam, Laos. Still today, China, Vietnam, and Laos remain communist one-party regimes, and they don't appear to show any signs of weakening. And the most important point of all is that 85% of the autonomous single-party regimes in power at the beginning of the second oil crisis still existed a decade later. So whereas military regimes fell in the face of those crises, personalist regimes, one-party regimes remained very, very durable. And that's a statistic that seems to underscore the key difference between one-party regimes and military regimes. Now, we only have 1 minute left, but I think we will address this question when we return on Monday. And the question is, what is the most important reason that one-party regimes survive longer than other types of authoritarian regime? Is it because they have a larger support base? Is it because party cadres all have an incentive to not defect because they depend on the party for power? Is it because they're able to legitimate themselves by reaching out to larger portions of society? I'm curious what you'll think and what you have to say to that, reflecting on cases like Mexico and the PRI, but also China and Vietnam and Laos and other communist one-party regimes. Even the Soviet Union is an example that we can reflect on. But we are out of time, and I appreciate you being here very much. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I'm going to stop recording it now. Stick around and talk to me if you want to chat or if you have comments. But otherwise, I'll see you on Monday, and I hope you have a great weekend in the rest of the week.